Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Society for Libyan Studies' first virtual annual lecture. It's just a reminder, we are on Zoom webinar, so we cannot see or hear you, but we do want you to participate. So please ask any questions you have for Professor Mattingly using Q&A. The Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen. So if you ask your questions there during the lecture, they will be answered at the end of the lecture. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Atkinson. I'm the chair of the Society for Libyan Studies, which is a British Academy International Research Institute. And it's a great honour for me today to invite you to our annual lecture, which will be given by David Mattingly. I'll say a little bit more about him in a second. I would normally say to welcome you here today to our annual lecture, but of course, I have to welcome you wherever you are and you're joining us from various parts of the world. We're very pleased to have people joining us from across the Atlantic and various other parts of the globe today who couldn't normally join us. So this is one of the advantages of doing a virtual online lecture. And we have an excellent attendance, we think, of over 150 people, which is about 3 times the amount we would normally have. So we're quite excited by this future way of doing some of our dissemination and our lectures and our public engagement events, and any feedback you have will be very welcome. You'll be getting an email after this lecture and you may be able to give us some feedback by that route. So I'm particularly pleased today that David Mattingly, Professor of Roman Archaeology at the University of Leicester, will be giving our first virtual annual lecture. David is well known to some of you, but I'll give you a brief sense of his trajectory and his history first. He did a BA and a PhD at the University of Manchester in the UK, and then was a British Academy Post-doctoral Fellow at Oxford University, then went to the United States to the University of Michigan, before he then began a long-standing association with the University of Leicester, where he's still based today, as the first lecturer and then reader and then professor from 1998. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2003, member of the Academia Europaea in 2013, and at the moment, and this is a great badge of esteem amongst his colleagues in archaeology, he's the chair of the archaeology subpanel for the British Research Excellence Framework 2021. So he will be overseeing the process whereby all the archaeology departments and the best papers and the best impactful research that archaeology has produced in the UK over the last 7 years will be assessed as a way of rewarding that excellence. So that's again a sense that his discipline views him as being one of their very top leading figures. He also, he's a very busy person, as you can tell. He also has a long-standing relationship with our Society for Libyan Studies. And his memory is a little bit more hazy on some of these periods he's served, but he was the editor of the Libyan Studies, he thinks 1984 to 1989, which is our journal. He was the honorary secretary around the mid-1990s. He was a chair in the late 1990s through till the early 2000s. And he's therefore been a constant part of our infrastructure and how we do high quality research in Libya and North Africa, and then how that is facilitated and organised by the Society and within the structures of the British Academy International Research Institutes as well. So we're particularly pleased to have him here to speak to us in his first virtual annual lecture with his title, Desert Landmarks, Rethinking States and Society in the Ancient Sahara. Just very quickly, some house rules. The question and answers function should be at the bottom of your screen. If you put your name and any questions you might have into that function, it should be able to, it will appear down the side of your screen or down the side of everyone's screens if they log onto that. And I will then ask questions on your behalf and potentially bunch them all together. I can't promise to ask every single question, but I'll try to get thematic groups of questions and put them forward. And after a reasonable amount of time and questioning, then we'll conclude the session today. So everything hopefully will go smoothly, but if you bear with us, if we have any problems, we will try to fix them and get them back online. So with no further waiting, I will hand over to Professor David Mattingly.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction, David, and thank you also for your excellent chairmanship of the Society in recent years. And good afternoon to everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to present today's AGM lecture, albeit in this remote fashion, owing to the extraordinary global difficulties that we're all facing. As was already mentioned, I think one happy aspect of the situation is that we've got many more international members able to attend than is normally the case. So a very special welcome from me to all of them. For UK members of the Society, you're probably pretty accustomed over the last 20 years or so to me popping up at regular intervals to report on the archaeological work in the Libyan Sahara I've been involved in. And no doubt some of you may be muttering, "Oh God, not him again." I hope nonetheless to have some new things to relate today. My opening slide captures the immense variability of Saharan desert landscapes, from great sand seas to inhospitable and rugged rocky relief. In rare but important places within and between these landforms, there exist localized green environments where oases are sustained through the exploitation of non-renewable subterranean groundwater sources. When we consider the vast expanse and generally hyper-arid nature of the historic era Sahara, it's all too easy to slip into stereotype models about its peoples and the socioeconomic development of Saharan landscapes. Such models have tended to present the Sahara as thinly populated and poorly connected prior to the Islamic era, with the main development of oases and trading networks in relation to the spread of Islam. Much of my work in the Sahara has focused on Libya, first in the Tripolitanian pre-desert through the work of the UNESCO Libyan Valles Survey, ULVS on the map, and then the southwestern Libyan region of Fezzan, homeland of the Garamantes people. In more recent years, I've also worked in the Wadi Dra in southern Morocco. Now, while in no way wishing to dispute the undoubted achievements of the medieval period, I would say also that my results provide important new data on those later periods too. My experience of the precocious stages of societal development in the first millennium BC and the early first millennium AD has suggested that the protohistoric Saharan peoples were much more numerous and further advanced than commonly recognized. This in turn requires a rethinking of our models of societies and states in the ancient Sahara, and is really the focus of the lecture tonight. Of most immediate relevance to my theme today is the Libyan Society-funded work on the Garamantes, where I have built on the pioneering exploration between 1959 and 1977 of Charles Daniels. The combined outcomes of the two phases of society-sponsored fieldwork are presented in 4 monographs of the Archaeology of Fezzan series. This body of work provides us with the most detailed archaeological knowledge of a pre-Roman Saharan people and the further transformations of their society in proximity to the Roman Empire. Building on this work, I devised a further program of research to take place from 2011 onwards. This sought to explore more fully the broader context of the Garamantes within what I defined as the Trans-Saharan zone, spanning the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan fringes and the Atlantic to the Nile. Funding for the Trans-Sahara Project came from the European Research Council, and the work was organized under 4 thematic work groups: urbanization and state formation, trade, mobile technologies, human mobility and identity. As we shall see, Theme 1 concerned issues of sedentarization and settlement more broadly. Themes 2 and 3 were very much focused on analysis of classes of material culture. And Theme 4 drew primarily on funerary evidence and a range of techniques of analysis of human remains. As explained here, the primary goal of the project was to contextualize the important results already achieved on the Garamantes within the wider Saharan world, whilst also pushing fieldwork and analysis further forward to enhance the data on historic peoples of the ancient Sahara. A total of 8 postdoctoral research associates were appointed in the course of the project, and Marta Lahr from Cambridge joined me as co-investigator for the Burials, Migration and Identity work group. However, because of the Libyan revolution following the Arab Spring of 2011, planned excavations in Libya proved impossible, but some new fieldwork was eventually carried out in southern Morocco. Although the inability to conduct further fieldwork or access our more recent finds in Libya were significant constraints, there were also benefits from the change in focus. For instance, the lab analysis of materials retrieved from earlier excavations was given much greater prominence in the work programme, as was remote satellite image analysis and radiocarbon dating work, with spectacular results, as we shall see. The overall results of the work programme were presented at a series of intensive conferences and workshops to which international experts in the field were invited to present comparative data sets and offer alternative perspectives, and to debate and contest our models. The focus of my talk today is to celebrate completion of the publication programme that arising from this project, and to present a rapid summary of the chief results. It should be immediately apparent from this slide describing the scale and scope of the 4 volumes in the Trans-Saharan Archaeology series that I cannot possibly, in the time available, do more than sketch out the ways in which the work has challenged orthodoxy and set out alternative models as a basis for future agendas of study. Beyond the volumes mentioned here, the project team have also authored around 40 other articles and additional works. It's fair to say that this has been an enormous collective work, and when I may occasionally slip into saying I or me, I really mean we and us in the sense of the great team. But not only the project team, but also the extensive network of scholars around the world who engaged in this work with us. The series, published by Cambridge University Press with the Society, constitutes an essential point of reference now for a very wide range of academic specialisms. Not everyone, I know, will accept all our conclusions, but the volumes, I think, mark a new starting point for debate and for future work to build on. They combine presentation of new material and new thinking alongside a thoroughgoing synthesis and review of the overall evidence. Although primarily reflecting the work of archaeologists and anthropologists, the debates encompassed in these volumes are also of the highest relevance to historians. We believe cumulatively that the data and ideas presented necessitate some fundamental changes in perspectives and agendas of study for the Trans-Saharan zone. The next point I want to emphasize is that although arising from the conferences we held, the books are not at all conventional conference volumes. Up to half of each volume comprises detailed chapters presenting the research results and conclusions of the project team, with the remainder made up of specially commissioned comparative studies or invited critical commentaries on our ideas. In what follows, I don't have time to mention many of these outstanding external contributions specifically, but I want to highlight right up front just how important they are to the volumes overall. The pre-circulated papers were not read aloud at our conferences, but rather they were briefly introduced by an independent expert, someone not involved with the writing of the chapter, and then discussed in detail by all the attendees, with detailed suggestions made for improvements ahead of publication. The resulting chapters in these books thus talk to each other to an uncommon degree, and finally they address important questions and debates that were framed by the editors in extended introductory essays. The themes of the 4 books in places cross over and interleave, and though the volumes all, I think, stand alone, they cumulatively add up to something more than the sum of the parts. In the end, I'm extremely happy to have achieved my vision of a series of co-authored monographs with built-in comparative analysis and critical discussion. I'll now run through the 4 volumes in turn, following the order in which they've appeared in print. Trade was the subject of the first volume, in print in 2017, and while the editorial team was a larger group, I want to pay particular credit to the work of the 3 researchers who were employed specifically on the research group for this theme. Victoria Leach, who worked on ceramics, Franca Cole, who focused on textiles and beads, and Chloe Duckworth, whose analysis of glass overlaps also with her work for the Mobile Technologies group. The chronological, geographical and thematic range of the volume was extremely wide, crossing over many established disciplinary boundaries. Detecting and interpreting Saharan trade faces significant challenges, especially in periods for which we lack detailed written sources. Although, as we shall see, there was extensive trade between Rome and the Garamantes, there are no extant source references to it. An equally serious issue concerns the skewed nature of the archaeological record for all past commerce involving the Sahara, where evidence slanted in favour of a few and probably unrepresentative durable artefacts, whereas we can surmise that Saharan trade has at all times been heavily dependent on organic commodities, including, for instance, textiles and slaves, on high-value items such as gold and ivory that are in consequence poorly represented in the archaeological record, and on recyclable materials, including metals and glass. The impossibility of quantifying the importance of these main commodities of Saharan trade from the archaeological record is thus a fundamental problem. A particular achievement of the volume was to highlight the significance of textiles and garments in all periods of Saharan trade, something that's commonly been overshadowed in discussions by conventional accounts tending to emphasize slaves, gold, and salt as the key commodities. New scientific approaches, as we shall see, especially compositional analysis of metal and glass artifacts, provide us with the opportunity to establish smoking gun evidence for pre-Islamic trade as well. More on that in a little while. However, some of our best evidence on Garamantian trade concerns proxy data on durable commodities such as Mediterranean pottery and glass. Such Roman artifacts have long been known from the Garamantian heartlands, including copious amounts of Roman amphorae and fine wares, and more limited but still significant finds of glass vessels. This is especially striking when we consider that the Garamantian heartlands were over 1,000 kilometers from the Mediterranean across very rough desert terrain. Breakage rates for this sort of cargo on Saharan trails must have been extremely high. Prior to our recent quantification work, some scholars have wondered if the finds could be explained simply as a few targeted gifts aimed at the Garamantian elite by the Roman state. This map demonstrates the latest knowledge of Roman pottery imports into just 2 of the main oasis zones of Fezzan, the Wadi al-Ajal to the north and the Merzouk depression to the south, with finds coming from both cemeteries and funerary sites. Our modelling suggests that many thousands of Roman vessels were involved. I'll show later that the social distribution of such goods was also very wide within Garamantian society, not simply limited to an elite group. The scale and social distribution of such material across Garamantian sites thus strongly identifies this as a product of a long-running and organized trade between this people and the Mediterranean. A similar point can also be made in relation to Roman glass imports into Fezzan. Although not as widely attested as pottery, the lack of finds in the southern oasis belt may be more a function of the relative lack of excavation and the non-intensive survey that we've been able to carry out there so far. A key point to emphasize here is that pottery and glass were inherently strange trade goods to carry across a desert landscape, and that the lack or rarity of such finds in other Saharan regions and across the longue durée of Saharan trade must be recognized as the norm, and the Garamantean situation as a clear exception. What was traveling in the reverse direction, though? Gold, slaves, semi-precious stones, wild beasts, salts, dates, and other oasis produce all have advocates. Lisa Fentress has made a strong case for the Garamantes being at the heart of a pre-Islamic and well-developed slave trade, indeed, to see the Garamantes as essentially a slaving state. However, recent work has also identified important evidence for a Garamantean manufacturing capacity, and this may well have underpinned a much wider range of trading relations within the trans-Saharan world, notably focused on textile production, metallurgy, carnelian working, and glass working. If we want to find evidence of the northerly, southerly, and southwesterly contacts of the Garamantes, I think we need to work through some key proxy evidence to isolate those smoking guns I talked of. Finds that can indicate indirect Garamantean or Mediterranean contact with sub-Saharan West Africa include the presence of Mediterranean-specific glass items like the eye beads illustrated here. More significantly, analysis of copper alloys from West Africa include brass, which in pre-Islamic contexts in the Central Sahara and West Africa attest to a trade and reworking of copper alloys whose ultimate source lay in the Roman Empire of the Mediterranean lands. Small ingot molds from Garamantean sites demonstrate the production of bar ingots, highly suited to Saharan trade and quite likely using remelted copper alloy metal that had been imported in artifact form from the north. Cowries are found in Fezzan and are among the very earliest examples known in Africa, and again are a small proxy of a wider development of trade. We also have a wide evidence of trade in Mediterranean glass beads, and Garamantean sites now show evidence of glass working to manufacture or transform beads. Systematic exploitation and working of semi-precious carnelian stone from remote volcanic areas in Fezzan has also been identified, and our chemical characterization work will hopefully lead in time to greater recognition of Garamantean products further afield. The increased evidence for Saharan trade in the Roman era is also borne out by quite a lot of iconographic evidence for the use of camels as beasts of burden. Our research has also revealed the use of a mix of different sizes of amphora in Garamantean trade, reflecting the employment of donkeys, mules, and camels alongside each other in caravans. Burials and identity are themes that we've studied in specific relation to migration. One of the major conclusions of the Trans-Sahara Project Burials Work Group was that there were many cultural commonalities spanning large swathes of the Sahara and suggestive of a sort of cultural norm or koine. Identity is well expressed in burials, and Garamantean funerary structures, rites and beliefs, along with integrated paleodemographic study of the populations buried in that region, were a central focus of the volume. These investigations have revealed significant variations across time, some at least attributable to migration, evident in the ancient oasis populations of the Garamantes. However, migration needs to be understood as part of wider patterns of Saharan mobility involving pastoralism, trade, slaving activity, and so on. The Garamantean burials case study was based on detailed survey of 2 areas of the Wadi El Ajal and excavation at selected sites. Many thousands of protohistoric funerary monuments were recorded, assignable to a range of types of burial, and with evidence of social hierarchy becoming more pronounced over time as we go through the Garamantean era. The typology encompasses a very wide typological range from classic Saharan forms like the mound cairn type 1 and the drum tombs type 3. We also find by the classic Garamantean era arise in rectilinear forms, type 4, and stepped constructions, type 5, as well as exotic traditions adopted for elite individuals, including mausolea on a Mediterranean model and mud brick pyramids. This diversity goes well beyond what is exhibited, at this point in time anyway, in other Saharan regions, and confirms that Garamantean society eventually developed in ways that differentiated it from neighboring communities. The dense clustering of different types of burial suggests that communal as well as hierarchical distinctions mattered within society. Many of these cemeteries seem to have related to specific villages in the Garamantean settlement pattern. Analysis of the funerary assemblage shows that though there were more Roman imports present in the more elite tombs, as we might expect, this is the right side of the graph, they were by no means limited to them. The social penetration of Roman goods within Garamantean society extended even to the most simple tomb types on the left side, where most tombs included one or more Roman artifacts. Integrated paleobiological approaches to the Garamantes have yielded important new evidence of heterogeneity within their society. For instance, isotopic analysis, principally for carbon and oxygen isotopes, has demonstrated the existence of important minority groupings among the individuals whose teeth were sampled. These individuals grew up exposed to different foodways or water sources, and thus came to Fezzan at some later point in their lives. Similar diversity within the Garamantean populace is illustrated by morphometric analysis of skulls from Garamantean burials, which reveal widely different types. For example, we can contrast some individuals with broad crania and narrow maxilla or noses, and other with narrow crania and broad maxilla and noses. There's quite a lot of variation between these types as well, reflecting long-term intermixing between different groups, which supports the view that the Garamantes comprise both Black Africans and Berber types. The presence of Black Africans and the fact that part of the population grew up in distant and different environmental zones raises questions about the nature of the migration attested here. It's hard to ignore the possibility that some at least of the migrants were enslaved by the Garamantes and incorporated into their society. However, the cemetery evidence also suggests progressive assimilation of different groups at all levels of Garamantean society, with no clear evidence of one ethnic group being dominant over the other in the long term. The final section of the volume focused on the complementary evidence of linguistics and what it can tell us about the nature of past population migration and when such movements may have taken place. The contributions of Chris Errett and Elizabeth Fentress are especially important in that they show how the complex Berber-Amazigh linguistic evidence can be brought into alignment with the archaeological evidence of a Saharan cultural koine. This is highly significant because it places the Garamantes in a broader cultural context, with a shared early Amazigh language being present across a large stretch of the northern, central and western Sahara from the mid-1st millennium BC, when oasis formation, trade and many technological transfers also seem to have been occurring. The third volume, in which Martin Sterry played a particularly significant role, focused on urbanization and state formation. But it also foregrounded these themes with discussion about the processes of sedentarization and oasis formation within the Sahara. The first part of the volume comprised a region-by-region survey and analysis, mainly by Martin and myself, summarizing the knowledge of protohistoric and early medieval activity from the Egyptian Western Desert to Mauritania and Senegal. Many new observations based on our satellite image analysis were also included. Once again, the Garamantes provide a focal case study of comparatively rich detail compared to other areas. We can illustrate precocious sedentarization and oasis formation in the early 1st millennium BC, and the eventual emergence of selected oasis centers as identifiably urban, and with Garamantian society eventually meriting recognition as a polity by its classic phase, that is the early centuries AD. Looking out from the Garamantes, one of the main conclusions of the volume is that these characteristics of early oasis societies were by no means limited to the Garamantes alone. Even if the development was most dramatic or achieved earlier by the Garamantes, the precise forms of urbanization and state formation that we identify were, however, distinctive to the Sahara and need to be considered in that light. When Charles Daniels worked on the Garamantes, he was only able to demonstrate the existence of a handful of settlements, and a major achievement of my Fazan work has been to expand dramatically this list of known settlements. With the aid of remote sensing, we've now transformed the situation with literally hundreds of sedentary settlements now known in all the oasis depressions of Fazan, and this is illustrated in the top part of the image. These sites match remarkably closely a longer known wide distribution of Garamantian cemetery sites. It's no longer possible to view these Garamantian cemeteries as the monuments of nomadic pastoralists, as was once argued. They clearly correlate with a dense network of oasis villages. The most exceptional Garamantian settlement was their capital Garama, interestingly described by Ptolemy as a metropolis. With its use of stone footings and Mediterranean-inspired stone architecture for what appear to be a series of monumental public buildings at its heart, it's hard to deny that this settlement has urban credentials. The eventual sophistication of lesser Garamantian oasis settlements, however, is exemplified by this fortified settlement that we have radiocarbon dated to Cal AD 410 to 545. These were quite literally castles in the desert. The settlement morphology is closely paralleled by sites in other parts of the Sahara that are commonly assumed to date only to the medieval and early modern periods. This is an issue that we think needs revisiting by careful examination and scientific dating in other areas in the future. I should add that we initially assumed that these sites in Fazan were also medieval until we started to identify Roman-era pottery on the surface of them, and then to recover organic material from mud brick inclusions to use for scientific dating. The dating program, some of which shown on the right of the slide, these are all dates on these late Garamantian fortified sites, reveal a consistent context for this type of fortified site in Fazan. The dating program associated with my projects has added altogether around 180 AMS dates to a number of radiometric dates obtained by Charles Daniels, and there are others available from the work carried out by the Italian mission in southwestern Fazan. A key feature of the urbanization volume, and a major resource for future research, comprises a full listing in a series of tables in the volume of the more than 1,000 radiocarbon dates that are now known from the Saharan region overall for the protohistoric and medieval eras, including new results also from my Moroccan project. Thanks to the data synthesis and data collation, we can now recognize more certainly extensive oasis development across the Sahara in the pre-Islamic era. Among a wide range of possible examples, I'll draw attention to the Al-Juffar Oasis group located between Fazan and the Mediterranean. Here, remote sensing has identified a series of previously unknown urban-scale settlements, some with Roman pottery associated, and we have radiocarbon dates that confirm that these settlements were active at the time of the first Arab campaigns into the Sahara, when a king is attested to have resided at Wadan. Similarly, the Roman frontier zone of southern Tunisia and Algeria was studied with Roman forts and major indigenous settlements at oases, some of which became recognized as Roman urban centers during the Roman period in Africa. The ultimate origin of many of these sites may plausibly have predated the creation of the Roman frontier, however. The Middle Drar project in Morocco that I've conducted with Yusuf Bokbot, Martin Sterry and Corey Fenwick has established the existence of an impressive protohistoric landscape of sedentary settlements and large cemeteries of the Gaetuli people, much like those of the early Garamantian era, with radiocarbon dates obtained on cereal grains, again indicating sedentary agriculture in pre-Islamic times, though generally showing a later phase of development than in the Garamantian era Central Sahara. The second phase of the Drar project is currently delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but there are some extraordinary discoveries awaiting our follow-up work. I want to just flag one fascinating window into the world of the Gaetuli, illustrated by these painted figures from late antique tombs. This set of maps illustrates our model for the gradual establishment of Garamantian networks of oases, of Saharan networks of oases, and more sporadically, urban settlements, a trend that seems to have broadly begun earlier in the Eastern Sahara, was strongly present in the first millennium BC in the Central Sahara, and is now also traceable in the Western Sahara in the first millennium AD. This has major historical and archaeological implications, but the evidence now assembled allows us to venture additional arguments. The identification of a degree of settlement hierarchy involving some higher level sites of evident urban character can be related to precocious, though always rare, state formation or polity development. Future work, and crucially more dating at additional sites, I feel will undoubtedly complicate the picture further. The Mobile Technologies Workgroup was built around the archaeometric work of Aurélie Queneau on metallurgy and Chloe Duckworth on glass. However, the research theme also involved other researchers from the team and beyond, looking at a wide range of technological themes and issues, from translocation of animals to transfers of irrigation technology, textile production, and handmade pottery, decorative and forming techniques. What is mobile technology, though? Technologies do not move of their own accord, of course. So what we sought to study was the movement of knowledge and skills linked ultimately to the movement of people, as discernible through the products of technology. Geography, environment are significant constraining and enabling factors in technological change, a point that is very easy to appreciate when working in the Sahara, but which is true of any other region. Similarly, we're fairly used to considering Saharan technologies as ways of overcoming the constraints of the desert, but the volume also asks us to consider what was enabled by this environment. Perhaps the visible ways for technology to be geographically mobile is being embedded in a fundamentally mobile society. The technologies of nomads and pastoralists at the heart of Saharan society, despite the rise of oases, are prime examples. However, the dynamic process of sedentarization and oasis formation also served to create nodes of connectivity within what had been pastoral rangelands, with these often becoming privileged locations for technological transfer. A key aspect of technology transfers in the Sahara has thus been the interplay between mobile and sedentary groups. Agricultural and irrigation technologies were fundamental to the spread of oasis societies. A chapter authored by myself with Andrew Wilson and Martin Sterry presents the evidence for a specific type of labor-intensive irrigation technology, the Fogera. And this can be traced across multiple Saharan regions. The Fogera comprises several elements: a mother well dug down to an elevated water table at the side of an oasis depression, a long and gently sloping underground channel that is constructed by connecting the base of a series of closely spaced shafts sunk from the mother well in the direction of the center of the valley, and a surface distribution and storage system from the point where the channel emerged at the surface at the edge of Oasis Gardens. For all that there was a basic package of technologies associated with the construction of Fogeras, our overview also reveals that these required novel solutions and adaptations to the lie of the land in different parts of the Sahara. The earliest dated Fogeras in the Sahara are mid-1st millennium BC in the western Egyptian desert, but we have radiocarbon dates that now demonstrate that the Garamantes were using the technology by the 4th to 3rd centuries BC as well. Detailed studies in the Garamantian heartlands demonstrate how these systems developed and intensified over time. You can see this in the left-hand image, with signs that the Fogeras had to be extended and deepened progressively to follow a declining water table. This is also illustrated by evidence relating to the delivery end of these systems, as visible in the right-hand image, where water tanks, marked by the dark blue blobs, surface channel systems, the light dashed lines, and settlements in red, seem to have been moved progressively further north to adjust to changing delivery points from the underground channels. These are the dark blue dotted lines. Fogera technology thus continuously had to adapt to the lowering water table, which was in part a result from the use of the Fogeras themselves, and which ultimately led to their failure and abandonment. Based on current evidence, it appears that Fogera technology was introduced to Egypt by the Persians around the mid-1st millennium BC, as I've mentioned already, and from there spread along the Oasis networks to the Garamantes. West of the Garamantes, there's plenty of evidence of medieval and early modern use of Fogeras, but the ultimate origins of these systems remain uncertain. Some elements, I believe, at least of Fogera technology must have spread in pre-Islamic times as well, matching the earlier Oasis development that we've now been able to recognize. Note also in the map how peak Fogera use in different areas of the Sahara was also followed by decline. Nor should we imagine that Fogeras were a uniquely favored system. As the left-hand map shows, Fogeras are only one element of a very complex pre-modern Saharan irrigation technology mapping. The overall pattern of Saharan irrigation systems is a complex mosaic of alternative strategies, with local adoption predominantly determined by varied hydraulic conditions. As in much technological change, it was not necessarily the most technically advanced system that was used, but the most appropriate in any given location. In many Oasis groups, in fact, we have evidence of contemporaneous use of different irrigation technologies, each exploiting a specific hydrological opportunity, whether seasonal floods, springs, an elevated groundwater table, and so on. At the heart of the Trans-Saharan Project work was compositional analysis of metals and glass. Orally, Queno's work using the electron microprobe and lead isotope analysis is important as it adds an important data set from a central Saharan location to set alongside comparative Maghrebian or Mediterranean and indeed also some sub-Saharan data sets. The work has shed important light on the early date and technological character of Garamantian metallurgy, already well established by the mid-1st millennium BC. I've noted that this suggests common metal sources existed, providing a ghostly hint of underlying trading networks across the Sahara. There are also some technological links with West African metallurgy, though much more work is needed on these and to establish the direction of technological transfer, as West Africa was also an area of precocious metallurgy. The availability of metal-tipped tools for Fogera digging and for cultivation also, I think, has major implications for the rapid expansion of Saharan oases in the period under consideration. Chloe Duckworth's analyses have focused on Roman glass vessels and Roman to early modern beads and bangles. Again, it's important to stress that the analytical data provide a significant addition to knowledge with data from a central Saharan location now bridging the gap between prior studies in West Africa or Mediterranean Africa. Her work has focused on electron microprobe analysis again and laser ablation, inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, LAICPMS for short. Both these methods analyze aspects of chemical composition and allow identification of glass recipes. As we can see in the charts, glass artifacts with similar compositional characteristics can be grouped. The evidence suggests that some products passing through Fezzan originated with specialist producers, focused on either beads, vessels, or bangles. However, at some Garamantian sites, at least we've got evidence of the collection of broken glass, cullet, evidently for recycling, and several Garamantian sites have produced traces of glass working. There's no evidence of vessel production or indeed of the production of raw glass, but beads appear to have been manufactured or heat modified from glass that had been imported in other forms. The evidence supports some of the blurring of compositional signatures that we might expect to occur with recycling of glass in this way. Overall, the mobile technologies volume demonstrates the importance of moving away from unilinear, unidirectional pictures of technological change that have demonstrated Western archaeology since its inception. This picture is rooted in the idea of technological change as technological development, which is fundamentally anachronistic, because its assumed endpoint is where we are now, with little room for the technological interactions, small-scale innovations, or gradual changes in already established technologies that our detailed studies highlight. Several chapters in the book address issues of the social context of technological choices and craftsperson identity, especially as this may contribute to the diversity of technological outcomes that we see in the archaeological record. The 4 volumes in the series emphasize above all the interconnectivity of the Trans-Saharan zone, and this has profound implications. A joined-up space, no matter how vast a desert and how difficult the transits and the climate, offered significant possibilities for trade, the spread of sedentarism, technological change, and transfers. It is not possible to understand the themes explored in this lecture across such a zone simply by studying one locality in isolation from others. A prime argument of this series is thus that we need to open out the scale of analysis beyond the insulated local focus and consider the Trans-Saharan region as a connected space. Yet, as noted at various points, there's still a strong body of opinion that the historic era Sahara was a poorly interconnected region prior to the Islamic conquest of North Africa. The archaeological evidence presented by us challenges this view. A second traditional narrative has been on an east to west direction of flow of innovation and technology transfer with echoes of old-style diffusionism for some critics. There are undeniably elements of the Garamantian story that support this narrative of Eastern origins. This appears highly probable for the Fogera irrigation systems and the early agricultural components of oasis farming, including the date palm, figs, wheat, and barley, the grapevine, and the main domesticated animals that facilitated the interconnectivity of oasis communities and underpinned the development of trade, specifically donkeys, horses, and camels. It's significant, however, that by the late first millennium BC, additional components of the Saharan farming package were emerging that can be traced to sub-Saharan precedents, sorghum, pearl millet, and cotton. And we can also identify other technological connections to the north and southwest. This suggests that there were multiple trajectories and vectors of connectivity besides the traditionally emphasized east to west axis. Nor should we see the Garamantes and other Saharan peoples as simply passive recipients of technologies and socioeconomic ideas. They were clearly extremely active agents in innovations and adoptions, as well as the further spread of these within the greater Saharan world. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you ever so much, David. That was hugely rich, enormously wide-ranging, with a whole series of innovative fieldwork programs as well, which has clearly taken a huge amount of time and effort. And then state-of-the-art dissemination and publishing practices as well, which were particularly impressive. I did, just for everyone else's benefit, I did ask David when I was just checking with him about my introduction, about his career, before we started, about if he liked keeping busy, and he said yes, he seems to just keep himself busy all the time, and there's ample evidence there. There's a huge amount of work and effort which has gone in by him and his collaborators on making this groundbreaking research evident. So that was excellent. We have time for questions now. You may or may not be able to see the question bar at the bottom of your screen, the question and answer section, depending on the device that you're using at the moment. But we've got some questions here, and what I'll do, please feel free to add questions to the Q&A box as well as we go forward. But there's a couple here from Dr. Timothy Norris, who says he's the son of the late Professor Harry T. Norris, who had undertaken a detailed study of the Gadames, recently published by Brill, and he wonders if Professor Mattingly could comment on the Gadames in relation to this wider portrait which he's been talking about and the wider geographies of that particular history of that particular region. He also adds, did the decline of the settlements arise from water depletion, for example, in relation to changes in climate?
Okay, well, I'm delighted to have this question. I remember Harry Norris really well. I think I was responsible for taking him on his last trip to the Sahara in 2002, when he came on a conference that the Society organized. Gadames, yes, is another great and important site and a clear example of a settlement that existed as an oasis center in the pre-Islamic period. I'm also delighted to hear the appearance of Harry Norris's book on Gadames, along with Corey Fenwick and Martin Sterry. I'm still working, part of my backlog, I do have a backlog, on a book on the archaeology of Gadames. So I'm sure we're going to find the historical records that Harry worked on especially valuable in filling out our archaeological picture. But there's lots of evidence for the richness of Gadames. And Gadames is a good candidate, I think, for another small-scale state-level society in the pre-Islamic Sahara. Certainly there seemed to be the potential for kings at Gadames and so on. Okay, on the question of water depletion, yes, well, we do think that the Garamantian exploitation of Fogeras, whilst it's extraordinarily sophisticated and clever at one level, also must have a damaging effect on their environment. In the Wadi al-Ajal, which is their main homelands, alone, we've recorded about 550 individual Fogeras. So these are channels that don't have a tap on. You create one of these, and whilst they are running, they will carry water day and night off the out of the water table. And if this is a non-renewable water table, as the Saharan aquifers are, given the modern, the Garamantian era day climate, which is similar to the modern one, then you will eventually deplete the water table through having such a large number of those irrigation systems. And I think one of the great challenges of oasis societies over time has been to come up with the next form of irrigation when the previous one has sort of mucked up their environment sufficiently. And we're seeing that happening in real time today, as wells are having to be deepened because the old diesel wells have now dried up aquifers, and we're now looking to electric powered wells going to much deeper depths than ever before to abstract water from greater depths to allow oases to continue.
There's another question just on water as well from Elizabeth Nathaniels, who said, what evidence is there of Wadis and Shadoof methods of water extraction?
Okay, so in the Garamantian region, not much evidence of the use of wadi agriculture, which depends on sufficient rain to allow for floodwater farming. You basically direct the water, channel water in the wadi beds, in the valley floors, try and pool a little bit of water and increase the water intake of the soil. There isn't that volume of water in the central Sahara. In the Libyan valleys area to the north, however, that was the standard form of irrigation. On the Shadoof, there are parts of Fezzan where the water table is really very shallow, only a meter or so down. And the Shadoof well seems to be a standard irrigation method used alongside Fogeras and other technologies where the topography allowed for Fogeras to be constructed. But for instance, in the Mazouk area, it looks as if the Shadoof well was, in the Garamantian period, the standard form of irrigation.
Okay, thank you. A question from Garth Bowden now, which follows on the Fogera's issue. He says, given the wide variety of inventive irrigation solutions in the Sahara, why assume the origins of Fogeras are in Egypt and ultimately Iran? Is there specific evidence for this origin?
Okay, we don't have specific evidence for that, but I think you know, the fact that these appear in the Western Egyptian oases around about the sort of 5th century BC, and that we have them, you know, a century later in Fezzan, and that there are some other technologies, a package of agricultural crops that are shared along the Saharan routes, makes the likelihood of some degree of borrowing, I think, reasonably plausible rather than a completely independent invention. But we can't absolutely rule independent invention out. And I think that's one of the great challenges with technological study, and why we need to do the sort of work we did in our project, which is gaining greater depth of technological knowledge and, you know, greater chronological controls on when changes occurred, so that we can understand to what extent technologies have moved, and to what extent we may get independent inventions.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions about, they've talked an awful lot of focus on the geographical reach and the diffusion of practices and processes and so on. There's a couple of questions, interesting questions about historical dimensions as well. Let me just find the one. Here's one from Neil Armstrong, who says, given all the potential wealth in this area, why did the Roman Empire not look to take more of an active role in this region?
Simple answer to that, because it's an awful long way. I've driven up and down from the coast to Fezzan multiple times. I think I calculated at one point I'd done the equivalent of driving around the globe in my travels up and down to the Sahara. It's a very long journey, and all the longer if you're traveling on camelback. So it's not an easy region to directly occupy and control. Rome, I think, we know did send armies down to Fezzan in the late 1st century BC and in the 1st century AD. There are several attested campaigns by the Romans against the Garamantes. As a result of those campaigns, a longer term, more peaceful relationship does seem to have been established, which then relied on relationships of trade. And, you know, I think that proved to be profitable to both parties. I think certainly the Garamantes had things that the Roman Empire was interested in, but I think they found it more practical to exploit through sort of hegemonic and diplomatic means down a trade route, rather than constantly having to invest a lot of military force in long-range desert campaigning. Okay,
thank you. The question is just whipped out of sight. Here it is. Gary Rager asks, your work has clearly shown that this is era of the gap between a long assumed trade-poor pre-Islamic Sahara and the subsequent heavily trafficked Islamic Sahara is mistaken. Can you say a little about how your work perhaps should be incorporated into the understanding of the medieval Sahara, and how historians of the Islamic period may want to rethink some of their views?
I think, I think there's no doubt that the Islamic era marks the sort of apogee of Saharan trade. We simply have a lot more evidence and better developed networks. I think the main point I would make is medieval specialists sometimes seem to take a particular pleasure in denying the existence of pre-Islamic Islamic trade, which seems to be somewhat self-defeating in attempting to understand how it is that Islamic trade then does start to develop and where it starts to appear. For instance, it's very clear that relatively early after the conquest of along the coast, military columns are also sent down to the Saharan Oases. So the Saharan Oases was seen by those early Arab armies coming in from the east as just as important a resource as the coastal cities and the great civilization of the Mediterranean lands. And I think the only explanation for that is that they saw and understood the trade potential of the Sahara from the outset, because that trade was already in existence. And indeed, the early treaties that we know of with places like Gadames and the Wadis Oasis and the Garamantean Oases make it clear that slaves is one of the things that they were after extracting. So I think, what we should see is that the Garamantean and other early Saharan traders did is that they create an embryonic network which comes more fully into life in the Islamic era, with greater intensification of routes and additional routes being developed. But the fundamentals of Saharan trade and Saharan transport are well established before we get there. And that's one of the reasons that Islamic trade flourishes so quickly.
Okay, thank you. It's a really fulsome answer. There's a question here from Graham Barker, who you know. Do the skeletal remains that you've uncovered tell us about different female and male lifestyles, working patterns, and so on? So the social issues of ancient society.
There are some visible differences. We've done quite a bit of work on skeletal analysis, and the first thing I would say is life in the desert is not sort of all sort of sweetness and light. No matter how good your irrigation technology, it demands on an awful lot of hard work, and a lot of our skeletons show a considerable degree of wear and tear. Osteoarthritis and other damage to the bones of people who clearly had quite a hard life cultivating those oasis gardens. There are some slight differences between men and women, but the only thing I would say is at this stage in our study, we still have a relatively small numerical sample that we're dealing with. So I hesitate, I think we have hesitated in our writing to draw too extravagant a set of conclusions on the whole of Garamantian society on the basis of the individual skeletons that we've been able to look at. But yes, I think there are some distinctions in the working lives of men and women within society.
I think that probably answers the question of Shabi Jouadi as well, who was asking about the socio-cultural changes and resilience to a harsh Saharan environment that you may have found in your work. I've got Paul Lane here asks, you've mentioned trades in enslaved individuals a few times, mostly with reference to historical sources. Did you find any material evidence of their presence, and if not, why not?
Well, I think there are various ways of approaching that. I mean, there are references from the Roman Empire to black slaves in the Roman Empire who are described as Garamantian, which I think is broadly a reference to the route by which they arrived in the Mediterranean, as much as a reference to Garamantian ethnicity. As I mentioned, we do have evidence from the Garamantian cemeteries for quite a range of demographic types, a significant minority, perhaps as high as 20 to 25% of individuals who weren't born and brought up within the valley, but seem to have been brought in at a later point in life. That would not be inconsistent with at least some part of reinforcement of the Garamantian population base coming through slaving activities from outside. And we do have individuals who seem to have cultural connections with other regions of the Sahara or with the sub-Saharan regions. We found one burial of a young woman with a lip plug, a very prominent lip plug in place in front of her jaw. That seems to be an indication of some, I mean, it's a very unusual cultural marker as well within Garamantian society, pretty much unique, in fact, at this stage. So she certainly looks like someone whose ultimate origins or cultural reference points lay outside the zone. We've got a lot of overlap as well with forms of making and decorating handmade pottery. And again, there's a long discussion article by Maria Gatto in the Mobile Technologies volume about the extent to which those technologies of working pottery and decorating pottery might have been something that could potentially have been brought with an enslaved element within Garamantian society that gets assimilated and replicates in a Garamantian Central Saharan context traditions that come from another part of the world. You know, I think these are areas that we'd love to follow up. We do need a lot more work, not just on the Garamantes, but on other Saharan Oasis communities. And I think, you know, over time, particularly if we can build up a broader reference set, say, of isotopic data, we may also be able to draw more direct correlations between finds in the Garamantian heartlands and other parts of Africa as well.
Okay, there's a question, oh, it's just disappeared off my screen. It was from Bruce Hitchner, who I think at this point would put his hand up and say, he's asked, he said, could you speculate on the political stroke institutional nature of the Garamantian state? And you mentioned the possibility of kings. So again, is that something else that you think might, well, you won't speculate, but is there anything else about the nature of that state which in particular struck you?
Well, I think it's a definite reality of kings. I mean, interestingly, the Roman sources, whilst at one level they somewhat denigrate the cultural level of the Garamantes, and they seem to describe them as nomadic barbarians. But at the same time, they do mention that the Garamantes are ruled by kings in a number of places. And the Romans tended not to lightly bandy around those sort of state level epithets. You know, they had quite a good range of other terms to indicate lesser tribal chieftains and so on. So the fact that they're mentioning kings, I think, is indeed an indication of the real sophistication of the Garamantes, which, of course, the Romans must have been well aware of through the military expeditions and the trading missions. They must have been aware that the Garamantes have at their heart these large oases communities, as well as the pastoral warriors as well, who must be part of that larger picture. Close to Jerma, we have a cemetery which is known as the Royal Cemetery, and certainly all the indications from our work and earlier work on that cemetery would, I think, tend to confirm that they are indeed the burials of the Garamantian kings. Everything about the tombs is supersized, so they are by far and away the largest individual tomb monuments that we found in the Garamantian lands. And then everything within the tombs, of course, heavily robbed before now, but from the fragments that remain, it's very clear that the artifacts they contained were spectacular beyond, you know, the relatively spectacular levels of the lesser elite burials of the Garamantian lands. So, I mean, just to give one example, a typical Garamantian carnelian bead perhaps is the size of your small fingernail. A Garamantian king's carnelian bead was gobstopper sized. I mean, absolutely enormous in comparison, and so on. So I think, you know, there are good material reasons for accepting that reality. And it's another argument that we need to recognize the state level structures of Garamantian society.
Okay, we've got 3 questions left, if that's okay, David.
Sure.
One from N.R. Jensen Jones follows on from that point, and he or she says, I wonder if you might say a little more about the tools and particularly the weapons that were documented. Were distinctive types or forms identified? Right.
One problem with the Garamantian archaeology, and with oases in general, I suspect, is that metals are something of extremely high value. So metal tends to be very heavily recycled. Tombs, a lot of tombs that we've excavated have also been quite heavily robbed. So we find less intact metal artifacts than we might expect or wish. A lot of the metalwork that we have found and have analysed, therefore, are rather smaller fragments of artifacts. Where we have metal weapons and tools, they seem to be fairly sophisticated metal weapons. We also have rock engravings of Garamantes that show them armed with a variety of weapons, including large javelins with metal tips. Again, I'd love to be able to say more about that. What we can say is that they were certainly had advanced metallurgical skills for working a variety of metals and producing high quality artifacts.
Another question, penultimate question from Roger Blench about other commodities from that region. He says, it is often said there was a wild beast trade for the Roman games of animals from the sub-Saharan region. Is there any direct evidence that you've come across?
It's certainly not improbable. We have some giraffe bones from Germa. Although giraffes were known in the later prehistoric era in the Germa region, it's not, I think, certainly not certain that they still existed, at any rate, close to Germa by the time we get to the Garamantian era. So they may well have been brought in. And, we certainly might envisage that the Garamantes are one of the sources by which giraffes reached the Mediterranean world. They're certainly well attested in Roman mosaics and literary accounts. Again, we know from coins and from Roman literary sources that Domitian exhibited an African rhinoceros. There are references to an expedition involving Romans and a Garamantian king going down to what appears to be Lake Chad, where the rhinoceros gather. So, again, I think suggestions that wild beasts may have been part of the trading activity, but they're going to always be such rare finds. If rhinoceroses are on the move in the Sahara, how many do we think are going to die and be found by archaeologists in the small number of holes we've dug in the center of Germa, for instance, as opposed to expiring on the route and simply being turfed out on the sand and then decomposing and disappearing?
Okay, thank you. Final question, and I think you will like this one, is from Anna Eiffel, and she says, thank you so much for the lecture. Knowing what you know now from these projects, what questions will you be asking next in your research?
Well, that's a really nice question. And, I think I'd take us straight back to the new work that I'm doing in Morocco, in the Wadi Dra, which is another desert region, but a rather different desert region. So I'm looking at very much the same sort of questions. How early do oases get going in that area? What's the nature of the proto-historic societies before we have more detailed evidence on the desert societies in the Islamic era? And to be honest, on the preliminary work we've done, the answers that are emerging are kind of reassuringly similar to those we've seen of the with the Garamantes, perhaps not as dramatic as the high achievements of Garamantean state level society, but certainly heading in a similar trajectory. So a side that almost certainly is engaging in oasis agriculture, in mining and metallurgy in the first millennium, but certainly by the first millennium AD, possibly a little earlier. That's one of the questions we'd like to tease out. And these are people who are really poorly known about through archaeological work to this point in time, and we rely far too much on the rather negative depictions of them in the Greco-Roman sources. So the Gaetuli, again, are another group who we were currently told are primitive, pastoral, barbarous, disorganized, and the archaeological realities are turning out to be a good deal more interesting.
Okay, great. Thank you ever so much. We'll call the questions to a halt there. I've got a couple of final notes for everybody. Thanks ever so much for everyone for attending today. Thank you for showing up. You will get an email tomorrow asking you for feedback on this virtual lecture. If you're not a member of the Society, and people have been invited who are not members, please consider joining us. It's only £30 a year, for which you get the journal Libyan Studies, and a very busy website, which has got a series of short video lectures on them, about 7 or 8 now. We've been very busy in our lockdown period. And we have galleries of images, and people can contribute their images of Libya, past and present. Free copies of our digitized books, our classic books, and also for members, competitive funding for research projects and engagement events if they're interested in that, in pushing forward on activities like that. Finally, for members, an extraordinary general meeting and an annual general meeting will take place next Tuesday, the 8th at 4 p.m, again online, so we can invite as many people as we can. But until then, thanks everybody for your questions, and thanks above all to David Mattingly for us, an excellent lecture and summing up all that fantastic research over the last few years. And so you can all, we can't give him a round of applause virtually, but we can I'll say thank you very much on behalf of everybody. I'll finally say good evening to everybody. Please join us again next time. Thank you for your company. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I will now close the call for everyone. Thank you.